Back when I was 19 years old, I was given the best piece of advice that I've ever received. I was told, Daryl, when you stop fighting, the fighting stops. Let's talk about that. Hello, and thank you for joining us on When I Stop Fighting, the podcast. My name is Daryl Dittmer. Today, I'm joined by T. Patrick Reilly. Tom was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, growing up on the South Side. His family moved to Michigan in the mid-'60s. He had a 33-year career in law enforcement with 3 different agencies, and a victim of child abuse in his teens. His book, Broken Trust, Uncle Fran, the Family Child Molester, A Guide to Prevention and Thriving After Child Sexual Abuse, is designed to offer hope and credible information for other families or for other victims, their families, including information to help prevent predatory pedophiles from connecting with children. Tom now lives in the middle of 14 acres in rural America with his wife and an 80-pound Doberman Pinscher who guards and protects them. Welcome, Tom. So great to have you on.
Thank you, Daryl. Thanks for inviting me too. I'm very happy to be here with you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. The 80-pound Doberman, I love it. We've got a couple of labs, and all they'll ever do is just lick people to death and say hi, and they might bark a couple times, but I think a Doberman is really does actually protect, which is wonderful.
Yeah, he's a good boy. So, yeah, he came to us from California, a rescue, and I drove out and picked him up.
Oh, wow.
And he, when I was leaving, it was my office manager's house, and he showed up there sleeping on the front porch when they got up one morning. The kids got up and found the dog out there. So, but she called me and she said, "Hey, Reilly, I think I've got your dog." I'm like, how can you have my dog? But turns out he is my dog. So, but
oh, that's great.
Yeah,
that's really cool. Yeah. I love dogs. There was a stretch in our life, in my life, when I didn't have one, and just work and business and busy and living in cities and that sort of thing, where for me it wasn't practical to have a dog, but they are just the absolute best.
You bet. I agree.
Yeah. So, I'm a big believer, and the reason that I do this podcast is because I believe, if there's one thing that we have in life that we can absolutely share with others and help them, it's our story, and it's where we came from, and it's some of the battles and the fights and the things we had to overcome, and I think that's just absolutely crucial to helping others, which I know is your purpose now, and it's also mine. So Tom, you have a wonderful book, which we'll certainly talk about, and your story is just one of courage and resilience, and I found it very touching for me. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, we'd definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I still can, get choked up a little bit about it, So when I read the introduction that you read on the back of the book, it really walloped me, So, but my story, early life in Chicago was, I don't know, it was filled with, really some kind of magical stuff. We had, we were about 8 city blocks from the school and church that we went to, and we walked back and forth to school. So, there was all kinds of things that happened on those walks, so, just fights and stupid stuff. Right. But when I look back on it, as I'm older and thinking about it, it's more magical than it was when it was happening, So my brother Joe, my younger brother Joe, is 2 years younger than me, and he and I were, I was walking him to school when I was going to school in 3rd grade. He was in 1st grade. And but we grew up in a house that was a couple of alcoholics. And, my dad was Chicago police. He had gone on the department in 1955, and by 66, he had gotten injured in a crash, a chase with a paddy wagon. I didn't know they chased with paddy wagons, but they did apparently. So, but he wound up with a really bad concussion, and he had a bad temper to begin with. And when he got out of the hospital after a couple of months, it was worse. So, there were times when us kids just had to listen to the roaring battle and, the punches being thrown and all that kind of stuff. So took a long time, for me before I stood up to him and said, "You're not hitting her anymore," and he said, "Well, I'll hit you." And I said, "Well, just know this, I'm going to hit you back." And we stood there, both of us, like two gunfighters, who's going to draw first? And he walked away. So that was pretty much the end of it. And I wasn't alone with that. My younger brother, Joe, did the same thing. He lived over there. We lived in the Lansing area, about 90 miles from where we grew up. So, but Joe has the same story, and in that regard. But the family, once we moved to Michigan, the family would come up for parties, and there were a lot of parties. And my mom had a lot of cousins, and just big Irish families, and we'd be camped out. They'd be camped out in the back, and we'd go to the nearby lakes, and when they were visiting and that kind of thing. But Uncle Fran and Aunt Patsy were on my father's side. And, we grew up with them being in our lives and all that kind of stuff, and never would have thought what happened was going to happen. But I started drinking, sneaking booze out of the house when I started working for the school system and drinking and cleaning up. I was a janitor at the school. And so that was 14 when I went and started there. So I was drinking already by then. And I wrote in the book that I didn't think the molestation had, turned me into an alcoholic. I think I was an alcoholic before it happened. But it's important for me to remember that it wasn't the reason I clung to alcohol. It exacerbated the alcoholism, but committed. I was committed. And if I wasn't drinking, I was thinking about drinking. So and I was at 15, there was a time when Fran started feeding us drinks, Joe and his son and myself. And for them, he was giving them beer, but for me, he gave me whiskey. And I took all that, that he'd give me. And I passed out on the floor in the family room, which is where the bar was, which we now call a shrine to alcoholism, but it was a bar at that time. And I woke up in the middle of the night with him molesting me. All things changed for me. And my aunt, his wife, walked through the room as it was happening, and I thought she was my savior. I thought she was going to interrupt it and make it stop. And she walked in, went into the bathroom, and turned around and walked back out. And so she actually knew what was going on. She knew what was going to happen. And the next night, she tried to get me in bed. So it was like this weekend from hell that I had no real way of dealing with, and I was ashamed. He shamed me and told me no one would believe me if I said it, and all that kind of stuff that it kept me silent for years, decades, but it worked. And it was all compressed into 2 nights, but it impacted me, Daryl. It, and I couldn't say anything to my mom or my dad. I wanted to. There was a big part of me that wanted to, but there was also a part of me that feared that there'd be a murder in our house if I did speak up, So, and I didn't find out that I wasn't alone until my brother Roger, my older brother Roger, he's 5 years older than me, and he wound up in therapy. And it leaked out of therapy somehow. I don't know whether he must have told somebody, but anyway, that he had been molested by an uncle, but he wasn't willing to identify the uncle, and because he was still alive. I knew who the uncle was. And by that time, Roger had a penchant for lying, and our family pretty much disregarded everything he said. But I alone knew that he wasn't lying. And we never talked about it. There was a story about when he was a kid, when I was born, actually, my family was living with Fran and Patsy on the southwest side of Chicago. And the story was that Roger had punched Fran, and my parents were out. I don't know what they were doing, whether they were out on a social thing or whether they were looking for a house. We were living with Fran and Patsy because they had moved out of whatever they were renting. But anyway, when they got home, Fran had spanked Roger for hitting him, and then my dad gave him a beating. So I think about that in terms of Roger was young and he had already started. And for me, I was mid-teens, and I think a little bit better prepared to deal with what I was dealing with than Roger was. With Roger, he just wound up, kind of being a rageful person who, drugs and alcohol were his thing, and he would work sometimes, and then other times he'd be out of work and that kind of thing. So I never blamed Roger for not speaking out. You know what I mean? I never blamed him for it happening to me. And I still, to this day, I don't blame him. I think he was ill prepared to handle it. And I don't know, we tried. My mom wanted to talk to him and ask him if it was true that Fran had molested him too. And I put him on the phone with her one weekend when they were there, and he wouldn't talk. So, and I don't think he ever said anything other than in those therapy sessions in the 80s, early 80s. But it came to the 90s, and by that time I had, met my wife in Miami, and we got married, and she was pregnant, and we moved to Michigan, and I was drinking really hard, and it started to come out. They divorced, and in the divorce, Patsy told anyone that would listen that if we didn't believe her that Fran was a molester, ask John, who was my oldest cousin, male cousin, Roger, or Tom. And she just threw all three of us under the bus. So, and 1993 was hot as hell. I was sitting on the porch every night in downtown Lansing in the house we had, and drinking and trying to figure out how to blow my brains out and not have it affect my wife's getting the insurance. So that's a desperate place to be, right? And because I was a police officer, I was always armed. And I'm just grateful to this day, Daryl, that I didn't. I thought that the right spin of irritation or a flashpoint or something, alcohol and the gun, and it would work itself out, you know? So I spent a lot of time in that space, realizing much later that how dangerous it really was. So, but I went into therapy, and therapy landed me in recovery. As I grew older, I realized that it was important for me to document this and write a book about what happened to me, hopefully to offer help and support for others who are victims of molestation. So that was the impetus for the book. I started it probably 10 years ago, wrote a couple chapters, liked the chapters in the start, and then just got stuck. And I wasn't motivated. But I started renovating a house on the west side of the state, and I was living over there and commuting back and forth from where I live to the house that I grew up in. My brother Joe and I renovated it and got it ready to sell. And we did that together for about 1.5 years, actually. So, but during that time at night, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I started writing, chipping away at chapters in the book. And eventually it became what it is, you know, one page, one chapter, one day at a time, it became a book. And I put in my story, which is a small part, I think of it. I really think that the more important parts are the literature that I included, the scientific literature for people to read and start to learn about what happened to them and how best to deal with it. I also had a woman donate a chapter to me for prevention. I had saved a chapter and asked her. I saw an article that she wrote that was really good on Psychology Today, and I reached out to her to see if I could quote the chapter, and she wrote back saying I could use the entire chapter however I wanted, as long as I cited her, which I did. And it was a tremendous gift, and I think it's a powerful part of the book is, being able to have some awareness about predators and how they approach children and what they do, and how much they can manipulate parents, and those kinds of things. So I encourage anybody that's listening that may share this history or want to know more about, child sexual predators. I hope you'll find a way to read the book and use what's in it to help you recover and become more healthy.
Tom, thanks so much for talking about your book. I as I mentioned early on, probably the thing that hit me the hardest was the courage for you to come out and talk about your story and share your story. And I think that's just I give you so much credit for doing that, because I know that certainly could not have been an easy thing to do, nor writing the book. But I know that, your intent and getting to know you a little bit through the book and just chatting, your intent is to help other people, which I think is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And in addition to being sober, you've been sober for a long time now. Yeah.
Yes.
30 some years or.
Yeah, I turned 31 in August of last year.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It's a blessing, Daryl. Real blessing.
It is. And I agree wholeheartedly. It's absolutely a blessing, and you're able to give in that way too, because you can give back to people from an experience perspective, and the things that worked for you, and it is a blessing. It's an absolute blessing to be able to do that. So what's the interplay between recovering from some of the trauma of youth, recovering from the perspective of alcohol, that kind of thing? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I was fortunate when I got sober to have been with a therapist that we started unpacking all the stuff that had happened in my childhood, right? So I was still drinking when I started with him, and I showed up at one of his sessions drunk, and he asked me if I'd been drinking. I said yes, and he said, "Well, don't ever come here again if you're drinking." And the way I was raw at that particular point in time, it was, to me, a point where I would have seen myself saying, "F off, I'm out of here. I don't need you." But I just listened. And it's probably the first time in my life as a drunk to sit and listen to somebody and have them say something like that to me, and to sit with it, So it was a real pivotal kind of piece of the puzzle. And then he told me about, he said, "Well, if you've got a problem with drinking, I'll give you a guy's number and you can call him." So it started the process, although I didn't call him right away. It took months to call him, right? But, I went to what was the central office at that time to pick up a meeting list, and they were having a business meeting, a board meeting or whatever, and everybody turned around and looked at me, and I'm like, "Yeah, I can't do this." But I took the list, and eventually by the end of that summer, I had had enough. And I told you that I was perched right at that pivotal point of what I consider to be the edge or the end of my life. And I was looking to go over that edge, ways to try to go over that edge, So at that time, I had bought a Yugo, right? So, and I had this little car, and I would drive by the Pennsylvania Avenue Bridge and think about hitting the abutment. It was just concrete, right? So that was one of the methods. The other method was riding my motorcycle up and down the freeway, taking my hands off the handlebars and just putting my arms out like that. And the gun was the biggest one. I figured that would be the easiest and quickest. But anyway, that's where I was at. And when I went to get, to my first meeting, the guy had called me and said, "Hey," I had called him on a Tuesday, and he said, "Well, I'm going to a meeting tonight. Why don't you go with me?" My wife had called me at work and said she had just bought me a fresh case of beer, and that was our norm, right? So I told him, I said, "No, I can't go tonight. I've got some things to do." But I agreed to go Thursday night. So we met for dinner ahead of time, and he's this cocky little guy, and I didn't like him. I'm like, I thought and he looks at me, and I'm in a restaurant that I'd been in before, but he looks at me and he goes, "If you want to drink, just go and drink." I'm like, why in the hell are you saying that to me? He says, "Because I'm not wasting my time with you. If you want to drink, go ahead and drink and come back when you've had enough." I said, "Dude, I've already committed to go to this meeting. Now, if you don't want me to go to the meeting, I won't go." He says, "No, let's go." So I go to a meeting. It's a men's group, and they're kind of militant, yelling at people and stuff. And they didn't yell at me, thank God, because I was not prepared to tolerate that, you know.
Mm.
So, but when it came to, I don't remember what the topic was, what the step was, whatever. It was a beginners group. So I later found out that they did 1, 2, 3 over and over and over again, and that's another story. But anyway, when it came to me, they said, "Do you have anything you want to say?" And I got up and I started walking around the table, and you know, they're all kind of going like this, and I knew that was not acceptable behavior in one of these meetings, but I was like a caged cat. I felt I had all this, you know. So, but one guy came up to me after the meeting and he says, "Do you think you got any good drinking time left?" And I said, "No." And I meant it. You know, things were bad. And I don't need to tell stories, but it was bad. You know, when you're thinking about blowing your brains out on your front porch, it's bad. But anyway, you know, that was August 31st, 1993. And one day at a time, I haven't had to drink since. And I didn't think it would work for me. You know, I saw myself as being terminally unique, that I wasn't like those guys. And you know, they talked about, well, you'll have a host of friends. I'm like, I'm not looking for friends. As a matter of fact, I'm firing friends right now. You know, I'm not looking to talk to men on the phone, and I don't know what to say, you know. So, and it kind of, you know, it got a little comical, but I really needed to be there. And I came to, it went from me not seeing how I could attend meetings where they talked for like 2 hours. It was not a 1-hour meeting. It was a talk till you're done. The last guy talks, you're done then, right? So, but I you know, I went in August, end of August, and I was building a spook house in the basement of our house for our daughter, and she never went down in it. Actually, she was too afraid. But the kids would come through, and there was all kinds of people involved. The old lady across the street from us, she was the Wicked Witch in a rocking chair, and you know, it was just good time. But I got a call from Miami, from one of our friends. She's our daughter's godmother. That one of the women I was training in Miami was shot and killed in a robbery. And I just, you know, all I had, Daryl, was anger and, you know, rage, and I knew how to hunt people. And I thought I was going to load up and go down there and hunt this bastard down, right? But it turns out that I had committed to call the guy that had dinner with me and took me to the first meeting, and I had committed to him that I would call before I drank. And I was a man of my word. I called him. I don't remember the conversation. I can't tell you what he said. I don't know what I said other than telling him the guts of what had happened. But when I hung up, I knew I didn't have to go drink. And I knew I didn't have to go hunting either, right? It was this instant. So I can still see the wallpaper and the phone. When I think about it, I can still picture that. But I wound up in, you know, that moment. I wasn't 1 foot on, 1 foot out, you know, that kind of thing. I was like, I'm in. I want to be all in, right? And I've been that way ever since. And you know, both my sponsors told me about the revolving door and that you can always come back, and you know, that kind of stuff, and that you're always welcome. But they also told me we haven't had to drink since we came in, and you don't have to either, right? So that has been my mantra. I'll do whatever the F it takes to stay, because I'm not going back out, you know? And I try to give that to other people, you know, you just got to make up your mind. You're going to do whatever it takes to stay here, you know, rather than step out for a month and drink and die, you know. And you've probably had the same experience, Daryl. We've buried people like that can't seem to stay. You know, they just can't get rid of whatever that is to stay. And
Right.
you know, so I'm ever grateful for that. And I give it to, when I got here, people would say, "Oh, my higher power," and all this stuff, and I'd be like, "God, I want to cover my ears." You know, I was mad at God. I was really pissed at God. And you know, they helped me figure out that I didn't need to have the God of my childhood, that I didn't need to, you know, carry around all this stuff, anger at God. You know, I didn't have to do that. And as they helped me unpack the trunk, life got easier and it got better, and I felt better. I still feel better. You know, I sleep better. I eat better. It's just, and now when I'm doing something, that host of friends is there, you know, and I'm not firing them. I'm not being a jerk to them or anything. I really enjoy being sober. And it was a requirement for me to be able to work through the sexual assault, you know, and it's a requirement for me to stay in this life and be happy. I did, you know, have this epiphany about the suicide ideation, you know, I putting that in my head. And I call them the whispers because they still try to whisper to me, but I've come to realize that my will to survive is stronger than that. And I needed that. I needed that to be able to, you know, say, even if you whisper to me, I'm not going. You know, I'm not pulling the gun and putting it against my head or in my mouth again. You know, and I'm grateful for that too, Daryl. And that came from being sober and having good sponsors and good people in my life, and sponsoring guys myself. You know, the lines get blurred as time goes on with sponsor, sponsee. Sometimes I have to call my sponsee and ask them what they think, you know, and that's really been powerful for me, to stay connected with the program. And it's just part of my life. I mean, you know, my wife knows that I'm going to be gone for meetings, you know, and I serve on the board of one of the clubs in town, and, you know, that kind of thing. I give a lot of time, but my life is better because of it. And I do like that part of being in the program, you know, when you get somebody that comes in and you see him come back to life, you know, and you see him grab on and you see him flourish, you know. One guy that I sponsor, you know, his story is similar to mine. And he said he kept getting interrupted. People kept stopping by his house when he was thinking about finishing himself, you know. So we kind of have that shared history. And we're both grateful to be sane and sober and not suicidal, right? So
Yeah.
it's pretty cool. But I hope, Daryl, that the book finds its way to people who need it. I've turned it loose, you know. I've just kind of, I'm not fighting to get reviews or any of that stuff anymore. I'm just, and thank you for being one of my reviewers. I appreciate that you did that for me. And I appreciate our connection with each other, because I feel connected with you. You know, we've talked but we have a shared history too, you know, of sobriety, and that is a bond that I could call you, right?
For
Something
sure.
beat me up, I can call Daryl too. So,
Yeah.
and I admire what I read in your book about how you practice this.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, it's powerful, and yeah. So, the book for me is its own life, has its own life now, and whatever it's going to be, it'll be, and I'm okay with that. It did rip me open to write it, and I did not calculate that into the equation at all. I didn't really realize. I just sometimes I think it's because I think I'm invincible or something, but I didn't really put enough stock in the fact that I was going to come off of that experience raw and mean all over again. And that happened. And my wife called it to my attention, and I told her she's right. I'm raw, and I can't help it. And slowly but surely, as I'm going to counseling now, the wick is growing length. I'm not as quick to anger. I'm not as, but it's still, it's still a process. And frankly, it's helped me a lot to go back to do the counseling again, to renew my commitment to being healthy mentally, And my daughter's a therapist, and she's an MSW at MSU. She works in the counseling center, and I admire her work and what she does, So I want to honor that commitment that I've made to my wife, and my wife and daughter both said, "Do we have to read the book?" I said, "No, you don't."
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah.
They
It's
don't.
amazing, right? Our families, and I didn't, my parents are gone and been gone for a while, and my brother and sister, I have a great relationship with my brother, not so much with my sister, and the whole family dynamic is such an interesting piece of this, but I got married about 20 years into sobriety, and I'm fascinated. My wife, she's read the big book. She's read the 12 and 12. Like she loves it. And she embraces, she wants to understand. And I just think that's the coolest thing ever, right? I mean, we get so much support, and not everybody does. And I'm sounds like you do. And I certainly do. And I'm grateful for that. I'm so grateful for the beautiful people who have come into my life, even long after, my first demise.
Right. Yeah, Laura's completely supportive. She, well, she and my daughter both had heard a lot of conversations with sponsees, and I don't put them on speaker, unless I'm in the car by myself, but they've heard my side of the conversations, I should say. And it's been good for both of them,
Yeah.
So my wife still drinks. She'll have a glass of wine or something. And I'm not cocky. I'm not afraid, I'm in a place of neutrality. And so I don't worry about it. At first she started, she'd like put her wine glass at the end of the table, like I was going to pick it up from her. And actually, when I was drinking, if she left her wine glass laying around, Daryl, I would finish it. I would tell her she's abusing alcohol, so let's get it done. Let's get it in your system. Don't mess around with it, drink like me. Right. Yeah. So,
yeah.
But that's so far removed now, and I'm free,
Yeah.
There was an old guy in the meeting when I first went in, and he looked at me and smiled. And he had this twinkle in his eye. I didn't have a twinkle in my eye. I just had fire, And he looked at me and says, "I'm free." And he would say that to me regularly, you know, and just smile, you know. And he was just this wonderful man, a Marine actually, and gentle, just, you know, kind, and he's the bar for me.
Right.
You know what I
Right.
mean? He's the bar.
Yes.
If I could be like Jack, at least 50%, 20%, you know, I'm good, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, and it reminds me of my sponsor, Bud. One of the first things I noticed was his eyes and the peace in his eyes. And I was like, I just want a little bit of that, you know,
you bet.
just give me some of that. And,
You bet.
yeah, that was crucial for me and to find someone like that, right? There's a lot of people who frequent the meetings and the tables and, you know, don't have that twinkle in their eye.
Yeah.
And those are the people I want to be like, because I want that peace and I want
Yeah.
that, right? That serenity
Yeah.
and wake up with a smile on your face and go to bed with, you know, not just the whole thing swirling all the time. Like, it's crucial. And I think it's crucial to have that, to stay, you know, sober, clean, whatever it is, to sort of exercise those demons.
You bet. I couldn't agree more, Daryl. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we best find your book? And let's go through the title of your book again, because I want to make sure everybody hears that, and I'll put it in the show notes and put the links in there. But let's do that real quick, if you don't mind, Tom.
Sure, I don't mind. Yeah, the title of the book is Broken Trust, Uncle Fran, the Family Child Molester, a memoir, and it's a guide to prevention and thriving after child sexual abuse.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's you know, again, the courage it took to do that, and the courage to talk about it, and you know, spread that message, and also the message of recognizing and understanding and finding help and finding answers, I think is incredibly important and absolutely crucial. So I know you're going to touch many, many, many lives. And that's one of the wonderful things. We may never know the lives that we touch, and that's okay. You know, it's we've done our work, and we allow that to have its own life. And I'm going to spread this podcast far and wide to ensure that that, you know, I do my part in spreading your message, Tom.
Daryl, thank you. Yeah, I can't thank you enough. And it's been an absolute pleasure to be on your show, and also just to know you, to meet you and to know you. So
Thank you, Tom. I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll be talking. I'm going to email you my phone number, and you know,
awesome.
we'll take it from there and stay in touch.
Thank
Thank
you,
you again. If you've enjoyed When I Stop Fighting the podcast, please check out my books and my journals on my website, DarylDittmer.com. Enjoy a 15% discount by using the code PODCAST, DARYLDITTMER.com.